The Stanton Distinguished Leaders Series brings to Georgetown University leaders who are renowned in their fields to share their unique experiences with students and alumni, as well as to engage in dialogue about leadership in an ever-changing world. The series was made possible through the support of Georgetown parents, Daniel and Mary Stanton, and we are grateful to them for their dedication to the Georgetown McDonough community. Today's events also is being held in coordination with the graduate and undergraduate GRLA student groups, as well as the MBA Alumni Advisory Council. A special thank you to Director of Events, Stephanie Martineau. We are excited to welcome the remarkable Pauline Brown, former chairman of LVMH North America, to the Georgetown University community. For nearly 30 years, Ms. Brown has acquired, built, and led the world's most influential global luxury brands. Before joining LVMH, she served as a managing director at the Carlyle Group, helping build the firm's global consumer and retail practice. She co-led deals while serving on the boards of Donna Karan, Marc Jacobs, and Fresh Cosmetics, and at LVMH North America, oversaw the development and global expansion of over 70 brands in their portfolio. Beyond her exceptional professional achievements, Ms. Brown has also undertaken noteworthy academic pursuits. In 2016, she joined the faculty of the Harvard Business School, where she introduced a new interdisciplinary course, The Business of Aesthetics. In 2018, she wrote a book about the course, sharing her theory on the importance of incorporating aesthetic value into brands' businesses and products. Today, Ms. Brown will be discussing her journey at LVMH and will also share insights from her book, with a special focus on the benefits and challenges of running aesthetic businesses from a strategic, financial, organizational, and cultural perspective. Our moderator for this discussion will be our very own Professor Arthur Dong. The question and answer portion of today's program will be towards the end, so please submit questions in the chat feature of Zoom. Please, everybody, give Ms. Brown and Professor Dong your very best virtual applause.
Thank you, Daniel, for the warm introduction. Pauline, it gives us great pleasure to have you here today joining us with the Greater Georgetown University community. And certainly wish to thank you for your graciousness in accepting our invitation to join us, albeit in an online format. So we're both sort of pushing the boundaries here, and this being our very first online speaker series, featuring a person as prominent as yourself. Referencing your most recently published book, Aesthetic Intelligence, you offer business leaders a manner in which to develop a way of thinking when it comes to the articulation of either a product or a service that they wish to offer. Can you describe to us how you define aesthetic intelligence?
Sure. Well, let me start by defining aesthetics. I was very mindful when I started to write the book, and before the book taught the course called The Business of Aesthetics, that this was not going to be about design, it was not going to be about beauty, it was not going to be about creativity. It was something a bit more profound in my mind and a bit more basic and human. Aesthetics comes from the Greek word aesthetikos, which has to do with the senses, the perception of the senses. And an aesthetic experience is one that lifts and arouses and pleases the senses. Obviously, it entails visual elegance, but oftentimes with design or beauty, it stops with visual elegance. When I think of an aesthetic experience, it's about all of the senses and really appealing to them on a number of levels. Aesthetic intelligence is the ability of the individual to ascertain what is pleasurable and why. In a nutshell, it's taste. And I struggle with the word taste because I always think it somehow demeans a broader concept that's very, very important. Someone with good taste doesn't have to be artistic, but they are discerning. And so the argument that I make in the book, and this is a business book, is the power of taste/aesthetic intelligence to not only lead businesses in effective ways, but also create and transform companies that are no longer relevant.
Yeah, you go on in your book to describe companies that have aesthetic intelligence, otherwise known as AI, and those that do not. Can you provide us some examples of companies that, in your judgment, have aesthetic intelligence, as well as some distinctive features of those companies that demonstrate their aesthetic awareness?
Well, so I'll start by saying in reality, companies don't have aesthetic intelligence, people do. What companies and brands have is aesthetic value. And aesthetic value is born in a group of leaders, whether they're sitting in the art department or in the finance department, who are both creating and also protecting the aesthetic value. The classic example of a company that transformed its industry through imbuing extraordinary aesthetic value is Apple. Apple's been written about a lot. The whole idea of computing and what it meant to have a personal computer on your desk and thereafter a phone and all the other devices that Apple has produced was really redefined in that era. But it did actually influence, when you look at a Microsoft store, for example, they are taking many of the cues that Apple started. There are so many industries that haven't even started down that path. The other point I want to make, though, and your question about which companies showcase great aesthetic value, it isn't just in the product world. When I take a company like Airbnb, Airbnb created nothing original. In fact, 20 years before Airbnb even started, you had Craigslist that was renting out rooms for the night through and creating a transactional model between the renter or the landlord and the tenant. If you went on a Craigslist, you were generally doing it because you were incredibly financially pressed. You didn't do it because you thought it would be a great experience. And after Craigslist, you had other companies like VRBO and HomeAway doing the exact same thing, but Airbnb was the breakaway success. And the biggest differentiator that I can point to as to why they were able to create something that transformed the overnight booking business is that the two founders of Airbnb were not technologists. They were actually educated at the Rhode Island School of Design. And in fact, one of them, Joe Gebbia, gave a TED Talk called Designing for Trust. And the taste level that they brought to designing this online experience really made people feel very differently about their proposition, even though the fundamental product was no different than their competitors were offering. And so that is a company that does, in a very narrowly defined and capable digital format, does offer great aesthetic value. I think Tesla offers good aesthetic value. I'd like to see them offer better colors. I'm not crazy about the silhouettes of the cars, but when you sit in a Tesla and you press on the pedal, and the spaciousness of the interior design, I think, is vastly superior to anything coming out of Detroit.
So from a strategic point of view, you've been successful in cultivating AI, allowing companies and products to stand out in a crowded marketplace. So in your view, can AI be harnessed as an element of competitive advantage?
I think it's one of the few competitive advantages, untapped competitive advantages that's left. I mean, we as a country, and actually as a globe, went through over 100 years of this industrial revolution where big business was built on scale, on speed, on technological innovation. And there was extraordinary progress and wealth created through those basic industrial advantages. But now we've basically taken that to its extreme. And very few companies going forward are going to win on scale, on speed, and simply on technological advances, because that gets replicated ever faster and ever cheaper. So I think it's one of the few reasons when you actually break down why do people buy anything. It of course varies by the segment, but a very small portion of the or a very small driver of buying decisions is a rational assessment of features and functions. It's important, and it's the price of entry, but they say somewhere between 15 and 20% might be a rational assessment, and somewhere north of 80% for that decision making is based on how that product or service makes me feel. And yet most marketers, for example, spend a lot of time thinking about the utility, about the functions, the features, the cost-benefit analysis. They take a very rational approach to appealing to people, when in fact very few marketers really fully understand the emotional impact. And I think that's been the secret sauce of companies like LVMH or my prior employer, Estee Lauder. While they don't produce anything functionally superior over what many of their cheaper competitors do, they create enormous emotional goodwill through their use of design and other aesthetic capabilities.
you observed in your book that today the mindset that's prevailing with consumers is that they want fewer things in their lives and are less driven by mindless accumulation, but really do crave a richer and more meaningful experience in the things they choose and the products that they buy. Can you unpack these thoughts for us?
Yeah. Well, so there's two ways to connect if you're a product or service company with a consumer, connect emotionally. And one way is what Hollywood, for example, has been doing from its inception, which is tell great stories and tell it not just through the script, but through the cinematography and so forth. And I would argue that companies like Louis Vuitton or MAC Cosmetics tell stories as well, obviously not as rich or dimensional as what might come out of a Hollywood studio. But the other way that you can appeal to people emotionally is you touch their senses. You touch it through beauty, or I even say some aesthetic experiences are not so beautiful. And that's okay too. There's value in things that are memorable, that are not necessarily classically beautiful. Case in point being in the entertainment industry, a horror film. Why do people go to horror films? They're horrific. They're scary. They make you hold onto your seat. Maybe you think you're going to die because you're empathetic with the character that's just about to be killed. You go because it really makes you feel human. It's exciting. Why do people go to roller coasters and amusement parks? You know, for that moment that you're at the top of the hill about to go down at extraordinary speed, you think you're going to die. And that is the excitement and the thrill. So there's when it comes to product design, there's a term I use in the book called jolie laid. Jolie laid is a French term. Literally, it means jolie is pretty and laid is ugly. And historically, the French would use it to describe a beautiful woman's face, where she was beautiful, but there was something a little off that made her that much more beautiful in an interesting and memorable way. And so often when I'm working with product designers, I say they should stop seeking this sort of idyllic perfection and the symmetry and the sort of supermarket approach to these sort of clean and very methodical aisles. And they should start thinking more about discovery, about surprise, about originality. That is aesthetic. So going back to your question, what can companies do to really create rich aesthetic experiences? I mean, it can't start in a boardroom. That's point number one. But point number two is double down, make it human, experiment, but experiment in ways that are true to your basic proposition, to the kind of value you're trying to offer the consumer. Obviously, don't be dismissive of the functionality of your products, of the performance of your products. That goes without saying. If a Louis Vuitton bag had holes in the bottom and your change fell through, nobody would buy it. But you're not going to win because it has no holes on the bottom and your change doesn't fall through. You're going to win because it's not only well designed and interestingly designed, but that it's presented in a way that completes the picture. And it's presented through its advertising, it's presented through its store experiences, it's even presented through the ambassadors who are selling the product. Every detail counts. And that three-dimensional aspect of selling is what makes even bricks and mortar stores still have lifeblood going forward.
Absolutely fascinating, Pauline. Going back to an earlier point in your career, after a stint at Bain Consulting, which was one of your first jobs after you graduated from the Wharton School, you were hired to be head of strategy at Estee Lauder companies in New York. You came prepared for your first meeting with your boss with stacks and stacks and reams of data, very much in line with your training as a Bain consultant. And your boss, upon meeting you, told you to toss that aside. How did this contradict, your past experience as both a consultant and an MBA? And what did you learn from that experience?
Well, it was a shocker because I thought I was doing exactly what I had been trained to do well as a business person. My alter title to the book, Aesthetic Intelligence, is what they didn't teach me at the Wharton Business School. I was so ill prepared for entering the type of companies that I did. And when I got to Estee Lauder, I had that very classic business background. Again, had gone to Wharton, had spent a couple of years at Bain. I remember the point, though, or the story that you're referencing. It was my first ever meeting with my boss. He was at the time the COO, eventually became the CEO. And he just slammed it down, and because he felt that I was treating the company that he was running as an observer and not as an owner. And you think about it, the decisions we make when we actually own the decision, as opposed to when we are advising others on a decision, or when we're looking at the world with a certain dispassionate approach, they can be quite different. And what I realized in that particular experience is that the professional me and the personal me should be merged. Especially in a business like cosmetics, if you treat it as dispassionately as I was prepared to, there's no reason anyone would ever want to be buying your product. There is no justification for paying 6 times as much for an Estee Lauder lipstick as maybe a Revlon lipstick, when in fact it's not because the color red is any different in one or the other. What is different is the experience. And it was that level of empathy that I had to get back to. And I had to undo some of the learning that I was so proud of coming out of Wharton and Bain in order to be effective in that new role.
Picking up on what you just stated, you describe in your work the importance of harnessing aesthetic empathy. What is aesthetic empathy?
So aesthetic intelligence, when I, in a word, described it as taste, is about how you feel. And it's not only how you feel about the various stimuli, whether it's auditory or gustatory, but at a high level, it's why you feel, what you like, what you don't like, and then how you can recreate it. And that can work very well if you're an independent contributor. So if I'm, for example, an interior designer, and I have and I'm working on my store, and it has to be my taste, and I assume customers will come because they share my way of thinking about how a store or a home should be designed, I could probably get away without having a lot of empathy. But let's just say I'm an interior designer and I have a wide a mix of clients, and I don't really understand what makes them feel good. And that'll be a huge limitation. The only clients I'd ever get are the ones that share exactly my worldview of what should look good. And let's just say I'm sitting now as CEO of a big company. It could be General Motors. You have a lot of different customers out there. And each brand may fulfill a bit of a different sort of psychographic portion of that customer. But even within that, even within whether it's Cadillac or Chevrolet, you're going to have still a lot of different taste levels. And while I think it's dangerous for big companies to try to appeal to everybody, and that's maybe one of the problems that big companies have seen themselves fall into in this era where we really are looking for more customized and individualized ways to express ourselves. The reality is you still have to understand what feels good to the other. And that is what is business. We're not in the world, at least the branded marketers out there, we're not in the world of art. We are in the world of commerce. And I like to give the example, there are many examples, in fact, of failures of aesthetic intelligence and failures of empathy, aesthetic empathy, as you cited it. One of the classic and most notable in the last, I'd say 1 to 2 decades is Google Glass. So Google Glass didn't fail because their research was wrong. It didn't fail because the functionality of the Google Glasses wasn't every bit what they had said it would be. It didn't fail because it was mispriced. There was no evidence that people didn't buy it because they thought it was too expensive. It failed because it looked really stupid sitting on someone's head. And if it looks stupid, I think there were 2 things. There were how does it feel? How does it feel on my head, just sort of aesthetically? And then how do I look to others? And what is it saying about me and my social status? And that to me is a classic example of a real failure of aesthetic empathy. They spent a lot of money without really recognizing how it would feel. Oculus Rift, which was the virtual reality launched, first acquired and then launched under Facebook, is another example where when it finally came out, it wasn't the enjoyment of virtual reality that was in question. It was the fact that the helmets were very uncomfortable in people's heads and it made them nauseous and it left little marks. That's just a failure of empathy.
Wonderful. Going back to another point in your career, Pauline, you've been at the center of leading major deals and many transactions for the firms in which you worked. Two transactions come to mind: your acquisition of Aveda, and then the acquisition of Jo Malone London for the Estee Lauder companies. Can you share with us what you found in both of these companies and why they turned out to be such successful acquisitions for Estee Lauder?
Yeah. Well, so Aveda was very unique in its time. It's not so unique in 2020 to see a brand in the beauty industry that's built on natural concept or love of the environment or use of materials from nature. That isn't so unique. But back in the 80s when it was founded and the mid 90s when we did the deal, it really was in a league of very, very few brands. And it was even a scarcer concept in the hair care segment, which was its core. So this was a brand that sold mostly shampoos and other hair care products to salons and had its own stores. And if you think about the hair care industry, it's really a supermarket business. 80+% of the shampoo and conditioner sold are sitting in mass markets. It's not, there is no Sephora for hair care. And we saw that there were women who really cared not so much about how did it make my hair look, but what was the sensorial experience of smelling, for example, the lavender, and of enjoying the products while I was in the shower. And even the bottle design was quite original for the category at that time. So I think it was a combination. I said before that there's two things that really trigger strong emotions. One is the aesthetic appeal, which Aveda was mastering in its fragrances, in the elegance of its formulas, in the way that it felt after you used the product. And then the second was the storytelling concept. The man that founded Aveda, Horst Rechelbacher, he came from Austria. His mother was a botanist. He studied plants and herbs, and he was just masterful at connecting the dots between two segments that really hadn't been connected before. Jo Malone is another interesting story. Jo herself, as she's written about publicly, has had a lot of learning disorders. So she was not a good student, to say the least, and came from a very modest background. But one of the benefits of her various disorders is she had synesthesia, which is a case where you kind of basically confuse the senses. So she could smell color, she could taste aromas, and it gave her a profound ability to sort of concoct formulas or fragrances that were quite original, and to describe them in ways that people in the industry hadn't described them before. She would use single notes. A lot of them would come from fruits, for example, or edible ingredients like vanilla, fig. And the industry at the time was all designers sort of putting sexy shots of models, and that was very crowded. That was very crowded. So she kind of redefined what it meant to use a fragrance and what a good fragrance could smell like. And then the other thing she did very innovatively is she realized that even if you're buying a fragrance for yourself, it should still feel like a gift. So she put a lot of thought into the packaging. And she didn't put a lot of money. She actually used a stock bottle. So, it can be very expensive in the fragrance industry to buy to customize a mold and make your own bottle. She used a very standard stock square bottle. But she came up with an unusual color palette for her bags. She had all the bags come in a ribbon. She packaged all of the individual products in boxes. So it felt like a gift. And a gift giving, whether you're giving it to yourself or you're giving it to someone else, is a ritual. So she turned what was sort of becoming a very massified category of beauty into something that felt ritualistic and felt indulgent. And we knew when we bought it, by the way, I should say it was very small. Estee Lauder was already a multi-billion-dollar company. Jo Malone wasn't even doing 20 million. She was in 2 stores, one in London, one in New York. But we knew when we looked at the buzz and the concentration and the fact that in those 2 stores, she was taking business away from the likes of Chanel, that she had something that was very powerful and building lots of momentum.
Yeah, yes, certainly in retrospect, both of them great calls, Pauline. They turned out to be wonderful acquisitions, and certainly, very, very noteworthy success in their respective marketplaces. You spent some time here in Washington, D.C. working as an investment partner with David Rubenstein and the Carlyle Group. During your time at Carlyle, you spearheaded the decision to purchase a beauty brand called Philosophy, as well as a luxury outdoor clothing brand called Moncler, and you tucked that into the investment portfolio. Remarkably, David Rubenstein had no experience in either of these product types, yet you were able to persuade David and the Carlyle Group to invest in both of these companies. What did you see in these two companies?
Well, so first of all, let me say it was a bit of a challenge. The firm's roots were in aerospace and defense, had kind of naturally migrated from there into heavy industry and eventually telecom. The idea of valuing a company on goodwill was so illogical to this otherwise, very measured thinker. And frankly, I think the reason we got away with it in the beginning was, number one, there was more deal flow in consumer and retail than in any other segment. So in a way, Carlyle, at the size it already was, couldn't afford not to play, but it did it was a bit late to the game relative to some of its competitors. And then secondly, the deals that we were doing, both the ones you cited, they were quite small. And so I think it was seen as, well, we can afford to have one of these in our portfolio. And if it goes bust, so be it. We'll, make it up on the, on Hertz Rent-A-Car, or, on Home Depot Supply, or whatever it is, on one of the big mass companies on the other end. Now, the reason that Carlyle continued to go down that path and has done very, very well over the many years in consumer and retail is because those businesses actually showed among the highest returns of their respective vintage. So if you pick well in consumer and retail, which is not easy, and it's certainly not going to be easy going forward in the environment that we're in, but you do get outsized returns. So what was it about these two companies that showed such great performance? Well, in the case of Philosophy, again, it was a small company, had a very charismatic and impassioned founder who was a rule breaker in her own right. She went on QVC when it was very uncool to go on QVC. It was unheard of that you would be able to maintain your position in the likes of a Sephora or a Nordstrom and still be on QVC. And Philosophy was one of the few brands that had enough leverage and enough of a following that Sephora and Nordstrom didn't kick it out, even though it was at its height #2 brand on QVC out of all businesses, all categories. So I think we saw in her somebody who had a lot of passion, who was prepared to step aside and allow business people to do the pieces of the business she didn't enjoy and wasn't suited for. I think we saw in it a different approach, much like I described Joe Malone in Aveda. Before Philosophy, most beauty brands were all about classic beauty, and they used models, and it was about outer beauty. And Philosophy sort of took this soulful approach. It really was about inner beauty. It was about making women feel empowered. It had names like Hope in a Jar and Grace and Amazing Grace. And we saw that women really responded. It was obviously it was a precursor to the Me Too movement, but there was something very empowering about it, not just being about a pretty face that was unattainable to a real woman and being sold by a real woman who was still very successful and very aspirational. Moncler, I would say a bit of a different take, although equally original. Before Moncler, there was not a single outerwear brand that I would call high fashion. So you had your North Faces and you had, various ski brands, and they might have looked good and they were good. It certainly kept you warm in the winter, but you couldn't have imagined that any one of them would ever do a runway show. Moncler comes about and it has all of the benefits that we describe in a good, parka, but it brought sex appeal to a category that was all about functionality before them. And there was really no alternative. Most of on the fashion segment, if you were not going to buy a Moncler, you might have bought a fur coat if you were high fashion, or you would just forego fashion altogether. So I think the idea that they kind of brought two segments together and saw that there was a huge runway and that nobody was playing. And then, years later, Canada Goose came on the scene and said, well, if Moncler's up here in price-wise and North Face is down here price-wise, let's go over here. But they, and I think they've done very, very well over time. but there's still quite a big range left in a category that's pretty universal.
And in terms of the exit on both of those investments, they turned out, according to your book, to be very, very profitable investments for the Carlyle Group.
Yes, they are. And, you know, had we known how profitable in the case of Moncler it would be for, you know, for the buyer, for Eurazea, who later took it public, and it still continued to do relatively well, we probably wouldn't have sold, right? It's really been a remarkable success story. It had momentum before Carlyle. It was a small company. It did extraordinarily well during Carlyle's tenure, and then it did extraordinarily well after Carlyle's tenure. So the one thing I would say for anyone who's considering private equity or maybe already works in private equity is momentum. Look for positive momentum. It is very, you know, I'm not a turnaround person, and, you know, I've always been in growth-oriented businesses and industries, but I will say if you start even with a little momentum, you've got so much more opportunity to play with than trying to you know, unwind from negative momentum.
You point in your book also the importance of identifying and cultivating quote unquote brand codes. And you assert that great businesses are built on an identifiable set of brand codes. Can you share with us what you mean by this?
Mm-hmm. So a code is a term that's often used in the fashion world. Hasn't been used very often in other areas of consumer, but I think it's a very powerful concept. A code, first of all, is nothing associated with what is actually the saleable product, but they are signifiers or signals of what that brand is. So, for example, if you take, and there's a number of companies that have very powerful codes. Chanel. Chanel may sell a bag, and that bag, but if I look at a quilted leather on a sort of baguette style bag, whether it's Chanel or it's anything else, I immediately think of that brand. If I look at a squared tweed jacket with a certain sort of iconic color combo, whoever the label, I think Chanel. When I look at the double C, obviously I think of Chanel. Another code. Codes are not just for fashion. Let's take McDonald's, the double arches, the Howard Johnson, the steeped hip orange roof. Codes can also be aromas. So if I walked past a restaurant and I smell, for example, a McDonald's French fries, it's so powerful that I don't have to see the French fry and I don't have to see the McDonald's name to basically know that's what I'm smelling. And I'd say, you know, Chanel No. 5 has been able to do that with their fragrances among people who are fragrance lovers. It's generally, codes are built up over many years. You can't build them up overnight. They're typically not started with in mind that they will be codes, but they become codes over time. And some things that are part of a brand DNA go away. But in the book, I was critical of, for example, the New York Times, when it did away with what I thought were one of the most iconic codes of that brand, which is its tagline, all the news that's fit to print. When they entered the digital era, they decided, reading the tagline very literally, that would mean they weren't fit for other forms of media consumption. And I felt that they took away something that was so much part of their history, that they should have held on to it in the same way that they held on to that very iconic font that is the New York Times. If I see that Times New Roman font, I think the New York Times. And so codes are, they're all facets of a brand. As I said, they're not just part of the design. They can be part of the aroma. They can be a formula. But when you have them, they're very hard to replicate in other brands. So they constitute, there's a lot of goodwill that's built up in a code.
One aspect of your book that I found particularly fascinating was the manner in which you classify companies within an industry. And so we're going to play this game. You describe companies within an industry as either being rule makers, rule takers, or rule breakers. And to cite an example that you provided us, General Motors in the automotive industry would be considered a rule maker, Fiat Chrysler a rule taker, and Tesla a rule breaker. We can do this for other industries, Estee Lauder and L'Oreal, the Rulemakers in beauty, Revlon, the Ruletaker, and MAC or Fenty, the Rule Breaker. Can you expand on this idea of strategic classification and how value can be unlocked if you're a rule breaker?
Right. Well, first of all, it goes without saying the worst place to be is a rule taker. If, if you're a distant number two and you're not interesting, you're never going to catch up to number one, and that rule breaker will put you out of business pretty quickly, as we've seen with some of the examples you gave, Revlon included. So rule makers, first of all, don't typically start as rule maker. So Henry Ford didn't, he was a rule breaker actually when he came out with this first car, and it was, competing with the horse and buggy. I'd say that, whoever the big brand of horse and buggies were at the time was probably the rule maker. They typically start though with a very strong concept. They build scale. They win on scale and share and resources. Rule takers, it goes without saying, follow the model of the maker on every front, but they'll never be as big. And there are companies like a Target, you could argue it'll never be as big as Walmart, but there's still a place for it. Although we could argue how they're able to sustain themselves being merely a rule taker. The rule breaker comes around, and it's obviously the disruptor. And it doesn't have to be through technology. In the case of MAC, it was through its point of view, its presentation. It was the first brand in cosmetics that kind of appealed to this punky grunge with its black. Nobody in cosmetics dressed their salespeople in black, for example. And they understood that there was this new movement in beauty that was a bit rebellious, but still soulful. And they redesigned the counters. And, there's a lot of detailing that goes into really owning that rule breaker category. Now, flash forward, 20 plus years since Estee Lauder bought MAC, and they're really a rule maker. They are not so rebellious anymore. And a brand like Fenty comes along, and Fenty's rule breaking was, first of all, having this iconic woman at the helm who is, and a sort of multicultural approach. I mean, for as long as I was in the industry, so we're going back many years, there was an outcry of especially women of color. Why is it so hard for them to get the color, the range of colors required? We're a nation that is a lot more diverse than any of the rulemaking or rule-taking beauty companies were reflecting and were speaking to. And so Fenty came along and had the authority, thanks to its particular spokesperson, to say, we're going to come up with a broader range of SKUs for the face than anyone else. And it sounds like a very simple concept, and it is. I mean, because as I said, that the need has been there for decades, but it was the execution that allowed them to actually win that position. And I would say over time, a Fenty will go one of two ways. It will either become another rule maker, or the industry moves on, and we've certainly seen many companies go away. They never become big enough, and they don't continue to innovate enough to stay as rule breakers. And that's over time, that's also a possibility as well. It isn't good to be rule breaker if you're in a standing position.
Coming back to your experience in the retail world, despite the current circumstance that we're all experiencing with the curtailment of travel, there's been one noted bright spot in retail overall that has been somewhat resistant to online, and that's in this category called travel retail. Mm-hmm. What was your experience during your years at LVMH with the growth of travel retail?
Yeah, so I saw it even well before LVMH at Estee Lauder. It was always the most profitable segment. It was smaller when I go back about 20 years ago than it is today. It's become quite sizable. About 30% of luxury products are bought in transit, which doesn't just mean at an airport. It could be on a cruise ship. It could be when you're actually traveling to another country. That has been accelerated by the growth of Chinese travelers. And so, number one, it's a very profitable channel, because you think about it, for all the advertising you spend, if let's just say you're Louis Vuitton, for all the advertising that you might spend if you're selling in Bloomingdale's or Saks to kind of get people to go to your store within store, you don't have to advertise against the airport. You've got a natural built-in traffic coming through. Obviously, it's a more affluent person who's already traveling, whether they're business or leisure traveler. And I'd say in the early days, the big incentive was the tax benefit. I don't think the price benefit is as big a driver today as the experience of buying something when you're on the go. But I still think there are some benefits. In recent years, if I were to buy, for example, a Chanel bag in China, it could be as much as 70% more than if I were to buy that same Chanel bag in Paris. So obviously there is for some brands more than others, a big financial incentive. And it's a very profitable channel. So that, when I think about luxury going forward, that it will continue to be a huge lag on the recovery. The fact that people may take a while to be traveling in the way that they were in years past.
Going back to your experience as a leader at LVMH and talking about perhaps your hiring philosophy, their companies adopt one of two choices when it comes to hiring, let's say, MBAs or business students. They can either hire on the basis of skills, or they can hire on the basis of cultural fit first. Skills can be taught later. What was your overall approach when you were working at LVMH with regard to the hiring philosophy at that firm?
Yeah, so I hire on, or historically have hired on attitude, on team fit, maybe more than corporate fit, and on work ethic. I do feel most skills can be taught. Very hard though to teach people fire, and to have people who just have the energy and the motivation and the will to sort of work through tough issues. Generally, it isn't the acumen that gets to the solution, it's the determination. Culture, I struggle with, number one, because cultures need to adapt. So when I think of the culture that I joined when, for example, in the mid-90s, when I went to Estee Lauder, by the time I left in the mid-2000s, it was a different culture and it had to change with the times. So, there are some people who are adaptable and there are some people who are not, but you won't really know that in an interview. But I do think whether somebody will fit with it, at least within their immediate team dynamic. And that is something I would pay close attention to.
One further question before we open up for our Q&A session. As a role model for women, what advice would you give women in this audience regarding some of the lessons that you have learned in the span of your career when it comes to this question of leadership and success in the world of business?
So, I've learned to defy what were probably the standard guidelines when I came into the workforce. One of them being, and I write a little bit about it in the book, but when I started my first few jobs, to be professional was to bring none of yourself into the role, into the professional environment. And by that, it meant to sort of, I refer to it in the book as being stylistically invisible, but it was more than that. The stylistically invisible is really just a symbol of being also, I would say, relatively innocuous and pleasant and doing things well. But, big companies especially, often give people the sense that they will be more punished for taking chances than they will be rewarded for playing safe. And so, I think the classic good girl was something that is not only a personal frustration because it's not my nature, but also made me sort of stay rather, down the center lane. And I found over time that the more I brought who I really was, which is a woman, but it's more than that. It isn't just me being a woman in the boardroom versus not. It's me being a first generation. It's me, being of a certain opinion and, even political leaning. And it's not to say I would, get into big political fights, but I also at the same time felt that who I am is the only thing I have. It's the only real advantage. and to be as connected to who I am and what I do well, and to make room for others in all the areas where I don't, and to be that sort of self-honest. And I would say the same advice to men. You know, I'd like that, from that comes a lot of power. And the question of empowerment is really, as much as anything, about being in touch with who you are and not being afraid to express it in all forms.
Certainly pointing to the power of being authentic. So what we'll do next is we're going to open it up for Q&A. And Daniel, will you please take a look at that? And let's see if our audience has any questions for Pauline.
Yeah, of course. We have a bunch for you, Pauline. So the first is, does the speaker believe aesthetic value or intelligence are qualities that can be measured or quantified in products or services? Or are these qualities that are more profound than that which can be quantified?
Yeah. So I get asked that a lot, because there's always discomfort in business with things that can't really be measured. The reality is you can measure the success. Obviously, over time, you're going to measure it in demand exceeding supply. You're going to measure it in pricing power. You're going to measure it in, net promoter score. But you're not going to be able to measure your way into producing it. Shoppers will not be able to tell you what will delight them. And where I struggle is often marketers go and they ask consumers questions, and it's always about satisfaction. I can tell you when I check into a hotel what will satisfy me. I want to go quickly. I want it to be, efficient. I want the person on the other end to be pleasant. I can't tell you prospectively what will delight me. That comes with imagination. So I would say, number one, that I would never try to measure it at the expense of allowing imagination to take hold and to be released. Number two, to the extent that there's tension between, say, the finance department and the art department wanting to express and push the limits, the finance department or the engineering department wanting to be able to measure everything out, that's a healthy tension. If there's no tension, I worry. If there's no tension, it'll either be bloodless or it'll be chaotic. So allow there to be tension, allow there to be a balance. At times the balance will be off, and over time, yes, you can measure it in many other ways that I mentioned, but not immediately.
Yeah, that's great. The second question is, a lot of brands that are driven by aesthetics are also perceived as niche brands, which can be negative when compared to larger mass market companies. How should we weigh the benefits of being a niche brand while weighing the benefits of growth and scaling, which could potentially hurt the brand?
Yeah. So Bernard Arnault has a great line that's been quoted, and I think I even quoted him early in the book. So we had a management meeting. Bernard Arnault is the majority shareholder of LVMH. He's I think the richest man in Europe, maybe up there in the top 3 or 4 now, depending on what's going on with the stock, but in the world. We had a group meeting, the top 100 officers of LVMH. This was just around the time that Apple had superseded, I think it was Exxon, I don't remember, to be the #1 most valuable company in the world. So it was just at that juncture. And everyone was talking about the feat of Apple becoming, the most valuable company in the world. And Bernard Arnault gets on the stage and he takes out his iPhone and he says, I guarantee you that in 50 years from now, nobody will be using this iPhone, but everyone will still be drinking Dom Perignon. So Dom Perignon is a small business. You could call it a niche business. It's in one small category of spirits, which is champagne. It's not the largest, but it's been around since the early 1700s, and it'll be around for a few more 100 years, I'm sure. And even the process of making it hasn't changed radically. So my point being that you have to look at value differently. And companies like LVMH do. It's not to say you have to worry what's going to happen in 500 years from now. But I think one of the problems of the era that we've come out of is that we measured success and these issues, for example, of scale and economic sustainability in very narrow terms. And it led to environmental destruction. It led to a certain depersonalization of products that make them rather soulless. And it's not working anymore. So to answer your question, there is a big difference between being Walmart and maybe being a mom and pop store with one location. There's a big difference. But I would rather, going forward in the world that we live, think about sustainable growth, healthy growth, about having very strong and deep and narrow and well-defined customer relationships, and about being profitable, than I would think about this sort of race to, to eat up the world. And then you find yourself in a WeWork situation, which is a disaster. We live in a very different time going forward. The original markers of success are, I don't think, going to work anymore for most companies.
Well, personally, I'm just curious. You mentioned aesthetic intelligence affecting growth. How would you, can you just elaborate that, maybe in terms of WeWork?
So WeWork, the aesthetics were not bad. You go into a site, and I think they were well designed and thoughtfully designed, but it wasn't enough. I mentioned before that really powerful aesthetics tend to take time. So WeWorks is a very young company. It grew way too fast. So had it taken one location in the way, for example, Soho House did, and really said, we're going to go deep and make this as rich and create as much loyalty and desirability in one location, that then became two locations, that now has, many, I don't know how many there are around the world, not nearly as many as WeWorks, but I would say in 10 years from now, Soho House will still be around. And I'm not sure in 2 years from now that WeWorks will. So I think what the problem with WeWorks is they stopped short, thinking that if we just make it look nice, and we just come out with very basic codes for how we design our spaces or our logo, and then we replicate that 100 times over or 1,000 times over, that was good enough. The reality is that starts to feel very thin very quickly. And by the way, they're fairly easy to replicate. There's a lot of companies basically doing exactly what WeWorks was offering, and able to hire the same designers and buy the same furniture and have a similar logo. So it wasn't rich enough. And it really was just racing to gobble up as much real estate and get into as many deals as quickly as possible. And I think in the process, it was a house of cards.
It's interesting because your response perfectly segues into the next question by Jazz, which is, how do brands tolerate when other brands attempt to imitate code? And are there any examples of codes being usurped?
Yeah, a great question. So when I mentioned before the case study of Aveda, there was another brand within the Estee Lauder portfolio when we bought Aveda, is called, and still there, it's called Origins. Origins at the time was about the same size, neck and neck. They were both about 100 million in annual sales. Origins, all these years later, is not much bigger than it was back then. Aveda is many, many multiples of what it was back then. Origins, many people at Aveda felt was copying it left and right. They were, copying the products and the development. They were copying the category extensions. They were copying some of the store designs. And the people at Aveda were getting very upset because they felt like they were creating something very original, only to find that some, fake company that didn't even have the commitment to environmentalism and to naturalism that they did was doing what seemed to be pretty much the same thing. And one day the CEO, my then boss, got up on the stage in front of Aveda, and he said, look, anyone can copy what you do, and they can copy how you look, and they can copy what you say, but they can't copy your soul. And I know that sounds very funny to come from the mouth of a CEO who is running a multi-billion-dollar company, but the reality is that companies do have souls, and they're really the souls of the people. When people talk about a company or a brand as if it's living, you're really talking about the individuals that are behind that are continuing to breathe life into that. And what makes an exciting company is that it doesn't stand still, that not only does it come up with a good concept, but it keeps developing off of the concept, and that the codes, it keeps building on the codes. I mean, why is, you take Coco Chanel, she's been dead for, 70, 80 years. But somehow the soul of that company keeps people coming back. And that is something that is, I think, often sort of very thinly described as culture. But in my mind, it's not culture so much, it's a belief system by a group of people who are continuing to take it forward while continuing to honor the past. And it's very hard. Well, a lot of companies are referencing, whether it's in fashion, you're referencing what's coming off the runway. In food service, you're referencing what's on another competitor's menu. To me, what makes for example, a restaurant exciting is the unique combination of all these facets, from the design to the menu to the service. That's what makes it an exciting proposition. And that's why I say aesthetics is an important term here when it's described as fully as I mean for it to be described. It can't be done easily. It takes inspiration, it takes originality, it takes time. And once you've got it, it has to be protected.
Right. So we probably have time for one more question. And this is actually a nice one because it's kind of tying into contemporary events with the pandemic. But the question is from Daniela, and she asks, can you talk about LVMH's recent acquisition of luxury jewelry brand Tiffany and how it adds value to the overall company?
Yeah. So first of all, to be clear, the deal hasn't closed. It's not inconceivable that it won't, because they paid a premium in a very different world than the world we have now entered. That said, let's assume it goes forward. Tiffany is a very unusual company. And by the way, yes, it has very strong codes. It did have issues and still does. I think the product lines become stale. I think, being a public company, it hasn't necessarily made all the investments that a luxury company as under private ownership would have been able to make. But if you just take, for example, the blue, the classic Tiffany blue, that, robin shell blue, it is so iconic. It is so iconic. There are very few companies, I could probably count them on 1 to 2 hands, that can own a color in the way that Tiffany owns that color. And from an LVMH perspective, obviously, they admired the brand, but I think that this was more of a strategic imperative than it was simply a brand one. LVMH, while has a sufficient size in watch and jewelry, it was its smallest category of business relative to the others. It also has not been as strong a player in America relative to some of its competitors. And so I think it was looking for a business that would really give it a strong position in the North American market. Tiffany's global, but it is one of the few luxury brands, I would argue maybe the only luxury brand that comes out of America. And you could argue a Ralph Lauren or others that often get grouped, Michael Kors. These are not really luxury brands. These are mass brands. Mm-hmm. Tiffany is still a luxury brand. And I think they saw opportunity to improve under the ownership of a group whereby the performance of any one company wouldn't necessarily affect the quarter, and therefore they could take longer to make some of the improvements that Tiffany could do as a standalone. Again, they paid a big price. The world has changed markedly since the deal was announced. And we'll see whether that opens the way for renegotiation or whether the deal somehow is undermined. But if they do go forward, they're going forward with the very, very long-term perspective that they typically do hold when they look at each of their brands.
Right. Well, I mean, personally, I am so excited to read your book.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Stephanie, did you have any words you wanted to leave us with?
I don't. I think Arthur was going to give our final congrats and sincere thank you to everyone for taking time to join us today.
Yes, we've run out of time, folks, but I wish to express our appreciation on behalf of the entire Georgetown University community for the gift of Pauline's time, her fascinating insights, and our discovery of what it is, our aesthetic intelligence. So thanks once again, Pauline, for this wonderful conversation. Be well as we all go through this COVID experience, and we certainly look forward to hearing more about you in the future, in the years to come.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for so graciously hosting me. I hope to make it down to campus in person, to have the real aesthetic experience of being at such a beautiful campus. And be well, stay safe.
We would look forward to welcome you back to campus whenever you would like to come. Thank you once again, folks, and enjoy the rest of your day.